Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 29 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Each week, we sit down with an historian to discuss their unique insights into our early American past, so we can learn more about who we are and how we can affect a better future. Trivia time. Can you name the battle that took place between the United States Army and the Miami Confederacy on November 4, 1791? This is a trick question. No one can name the battle that took place on November 4, 1791, because the victory has no name. Colin Calloway, professor of history and Native American history at Dartmouth College, joins us to discuss how American settlement in the Ohio Valley led to the victory with no name and the Native American defeat of the First American Army. During our conversation, Colin will reveal information about the Old Northwest Territory, its location, and its quick settlement after the American Revolution. Details about how Americans and Native Americans negotiated for land after the United States achieved independence. And how the Native American warriors of the Miami Confederacy came to rout the First United States Army and the lessons that the United States took away from its colossal defeat. So let's get into this interesting investigation. Allow me to introduce you to Colin Calloway.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Colin Calloway is the John Kimball Jr. 1943 Professor of History and Native American Studies at Dartmouth College. He has published 9 books, including Pen and Ink Witchcraft, Treaties and Treaty Making in American Indian History, and, most recently, The Victory with No Name, the Native American Defeat of the First American Army. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Colin.
Thank you, Liz. Pleasure to be here.
I have to say, The Victory with No Name is a really provocative title because we don't normally think of military victories as being nameless, do we?
That's right. And it's one of those battles, I should say, that gets assigned a name as a defeat, like Braddock's defeat and Sinclair's defeat, which, of course, gives it a lopsided dimension and deprives one side of any credit, if that's the right word, for the outcome of the battle.
Well, we are going to talk pretty in depth about this battle, but before we dive in, would you tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to your interest in Native American history?
Well, born and raised, grew up in the north of England with an English father and a Scottish mother, so I suppose that put me on some kind of cultural borderland. But I think, and I've obviously been asked this question a lot over the years, I think as a non-American, as a European, a Brit, doing American history, the thing that most intrigued me about American history was the presence of Native American people. But certainly at that time, most of the American history books that I read did not include Native American people. So that seemed to me a huge omission. So as a non-Native person doing this kind of work, I tend to think of myself as somebody who's doing American history with Indians in it. And I think that that's an important thing to do because in lots of ways, the history of this nation doesn't make much sense without including Native Americans.
So let's get into this battle. So the Victory with No Name took place on November 4th, 1791, and it involved about 1,400 United States Army soldiers led by Arthur Sinclair and many Native American peoples who had formed a confederacy to protect their lands and families and the Old Northwest Territories. Colin, would you provide us with a brief overview of where the Old Northwest Territory was and what prompted Anglo-Americans to begin settling it not long after the United States achieved independence?
Basically, the Northwest Territory is that territory north and west of the Ohio River. The Ohio River had been designated as a kind of boundary between Indian and white settlement at the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768. And through the Revolution, Indian people had kind of fought to maintain that, that boundary. After the Revolution, when the United States is independent but broke, it obviously is looking to the western lands that have been conveyed to it by Britain as an area for expansion by settling and selling these lands, what the government called public lands. You can fill the nation's coffers, you can function as a government, all those kinds of things. The Northwest Territory kind of channels government's attention, of course, because after the Revolution, the northern states who had claims to western land are the first to relinquish those claims to the federal government. The southern states, like Georgia, for instance, which did not give up its claims until 1802, held on to theirs. So although there's pressure on western lands all up and down the frontier, the national interest and the federal government's attention is focused on what it calls the Northwest Territory. And in 1787, Congress issues this Northwest Ordinance. It's a culmination of a series of land ordinances, basically setting out how the government will deal with territories, how they will create an orderly process of settlement. And the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 kind of sets the blueprint for national expansion. It explains how territories will eventually become states. And out of this area called the Old Northwest, eventually a half dozen states enter the Union: Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, etc.
The United States government laid out how they wanted the Old Northwest Territory to look like, how they wanted to settle it. But this land was not devoid of peoples. And one of the things that fascinated me about your book was your description of just how many Native American groups are living in that territory. And many of them didn't seem to have ancestral ties to the land. They just ended up there, like the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois peoples who had once lived in New York. So, Colin, would you describe how the United States' victory and the War for Independence affected the lives of Native American peoples in the 13 former colonies, and how and why so many of them came to settle in the Ohio Valley and Old Northwest Territory?
Yeah, and I'll maybe take the second portion of the question first, because the Ohio Valley and the Ohio country is a fascinating region of Native American history. It had been a center of Native population from time immemorial, I guess, as far as we can tell. But in about the middle of the 17th century, when there's a tremendous upheaval in Indian country under the impact of trade wars and disease, there's outmigration from that area. And so the Shawnees in particular, we can trace going south, east, and west into different directions. Certainly by the middle of the 18th century, they've come home. Most Shawnees are back in south central Ohio. They're joined there with Delaware people who've been pressured west from Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. They're joined there by Haudenosaunee people, members of the Iroquois Confederacy, particularly Senecas and Cayugas who've moved into that area, and the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, has a sort of residual claims to influence over the area. There are Wyandot or Wendat people in the northern part of the region around what is now Detroit, Sandusky, who are migrants from what was formerly the Huron Confederacy. There are Miami people drawn into the area from the west, looking to connect more directly with traders from Pennsylvania and Virginia. And so this is a multi-ethnic, multinational arena. And so when the United States pushes into that area, it's not just dealing with Indians, it's dealing with a multiplicity of tribes and nations, all of whom have, if you like, their own foreign policies, which they conduct not only in dealing with the United States, but also in dealing with other Indian nations. And during the Revolution, of course, these people had been fighting to protect their homelands and had formed a coalition of sorts, often with the allegiance of the British. They made common cause with the British, most of them. And for these people, this was not, I think, a choice. They were not driven by any love of King George, but rather by a realistic appraisal of their situation, that the British Empire, for all of its faults, and there were many, had, at least with the proclamation of 1763, for instance, attempted to restrain the flood of settlement onto Indian land. From what Indian people could glean by the outbreak of the American Revolution, the Americans, rebels, if you like, were inclined to do quite the opposite. In fact, many of the people who were most vocal in demands for independence were people who wanted to throw off those British restraints and have open access to Indian land. So the British defeat in the Revolution was, for many Indian people, and they described it as this, a disaster, because it opened the floodgates. It seemed to them that it opened the floodgates for American expansion into what was their homelands.
It seemed that after the war, many Americans, governments, especially in places like New York, they worked to dispossess the Native American peoples of their lands. But it also seemed like the United States government and other state governments made an attempt to purchase land from Native American peoples. Could you tell us what these negotiations were like? Were the Americans actually trying to deal fairly with Native American peoples?
What they do, of course, is to, in many ways, continue the procedures that the British colonies and the British government had used in dealing with Indian people and acquiring Indian land, and that is to obtain it by treaty. That at least gave a semblance of legality and fair dealings. And so when independence is secured, the states and the federal government both continue to do that. And of course, that's an area of tension too, because the federal government is trying to, and eventually does under the Constitution, secure for itself the authority to conduct Indian treaty and Indian affairs. The states tend to be defensive of their rights, tend to be more aggressive very often in their dealings with Indian peoples. The federal government at first takes the stance that by having defeated Britain, it has acquired the Indians' lands as defeated allies of Britain by right of conquest. But that causes quite a few problems. It causes considerable resentment. The treaties that are made in that way tend to be dictated treaties that Indians disavow. And so Henry Knox, who was Secretary of War at the time and person primarily responsible for Indian affairs, and George Washington, both look towards a more honorable way of dealing with Indians. And they use that term decidedly because what they are concerned with is national honor as well as a more humanitarian approach to Indians. And they try to make this process more fair, more equitable. And I think, having read through their correspondence, and I've read through it quite a lot, quite closely, I think from our perspective today, it's very easy to dismiss this as hypocrisy. I get the sense that they actually are struggling to do the right thing. The problem is, of course, that their whole policy is predicated on the certainty that Indians will and must give up their land. So when Washington and Knox talk about a reasonable peace and a fair peace, it's one that involves Indians giving up their land. The terms might be reasonable, but you're still going to give up the land. And of course, for Indian peoples, the land is something different. It's not just a commodity to be measured and bought and sold. It's a source of identity, a source of culture, and a homeland. So the very fact that Indian people are going to refuse to give up their land means that they will refuse these just terms that will be offered them, and that will open the way for conflict, and that conflict will therefore be just because the United States has done everything it can to obtain peace, but the Indians refuse that peace. So it's a kind of tortuous path to war, but I think it's one in which the founding fathers, if you like, are trying to chart a course that is fair, but they never have a chance because their bottom line is always, we must have Indian land.
The Native American peoples who had settled in the Old Northwest Territory seem that they have dealt with the Americans before. There's a long history of dealing with Euro-American settlers and land. And surely they received this vibe from the Americans that we're going to get your land whether we pay you for it or take it from you. Did they ever attempt to form a united front against the United States as the 13 colonies once had against Great Britain?
Yes, they did. And in fact, of course, confederating, it was nothing new in Indian country. I mean, you have the model of the famous model of the Iroquois Confederacy, and Indian nations and tribes had come together before in effective united action. The Pontiac's War in 1763, for instance, and during the American Revolution, there was an extensive alliance of Indian peoples. In the assault on the Northwest Territory, in meeting the assault on the Northwest Territory, Indian people kind of inevitably have to form a coalition because of the nature of the inhabitants of that territory. As we said before, there's a variety of different Indian nations there. And so part of their response to this American assault is diplomatic, not only in trying to make treaties and talk with and deal with the Americans, but in also making alliances among themselves. They build coalitions because these are not people who automatically are going to respond lockstep to any external threat. Some of their people of different languages, different historical experiences, sometimes with historical animosities that need to be smoothed over. And so part of the achievement of the Native Americans in this struggle is being able to build a confederacy of their own, which kind of matches that of the United States, which is confronting them.
So we've laid out the two sides. We know where the Americans stand. They want the land or they're prepared to take it. We know where the Native Americans stand. They're going to try and protect their homelands, and they've confederated all of these different peoples in the Old Northwest Territory to accomplish that goal. But what your book, A Victory with No Name, reveals is there's a bit of intrigue. There almost is like a third player involved in this story, and that appears to be the Ohio Land Company. So would you tell us what the Ohio Land Company was, who was involved in it? What role did land speculation play in fomenting trouble in the Old Northwest Territory?
Yeah, and land speculation is huge, and of course, in lots of ways, it's all about land. The Ohio Company, the Ohio Company of Associates, I think was their full name. It's basically a group primarily of New Englanders. They're often men of standing. They're often veteran officers from the Revolutionary War. Many of whom felt that perhaps their sacrifices and services in that war had not been adequately compensating. And in 1786 in Boston, they formed this company. It was basically a syndicate that sold stock to speculators and then requested or petitioned the federal government for huge grants of land in Ohio. The idea was they would raise $1 million in continental notes. Obviously, these things were, as they said, not worth a continental, so it's kind of depreciated currency. And then they would purchase 1.5 million acres of land from Congress. And the idea here is that this would be something that matched private and government interests. And of course, this is something that we see again in westward expansion in this country, railroads and Congress in the 19th century, land companies and Congress in the late 18th century, because obviously these land speculators were in it for themselves. They aimed to make a killing. They would get land from Congress, a land grant from Congress. They would then be able to sell or rent that land to settlers, to immigrants who went west. But they were able to propose this to Congress having a receptive ear, because how they saw the settlement of the Northwest was how Congress and Washington, the people in government, saw it. South of the Ohio, when they looked at places like Kentucky, they saw bloodshed and confusion and a scramble for land. In the Northwest Territory, what they wanted was an orderly settlement under the auspices of government, conducted by men of standing. Kind of the idea, I think, was to replicate the model of the New England town, settling families on plots of land in an orderly manner. Congress also lent a ready ear, of course, because many people in Congress were friends and associates, acquaintances of people in the Ohio Company. Some of them actually were in the Ohio Company. This was the 18th century, and I don't think there was that sense of conflicts of interest in the way that we hopefully have it today. This was the idea that these were gentlemen of reputation, respectability, and whether they were in the private sphere or the public sphere, they were acting in the good of the country. So when we think of the American frontier, of course, our image is one that, movies and I guess often politicians have perpetuated, that it's individual families wresting a living from a wilderness environment. And I suppose, and of course to some extent that's true, but back of it, there's very often these land companies who are the people who are really out to make the money. And they're the people who have influence in government and who can kind of shape government policy. And as I argue in the book, can push for a military solution to the difficulties that are arising in the Ohio, because unless the quote-unquote Indian problem is resolved, they're not going to make their fortunes on these lands in which they're speculating. You need to resolve this conflict before you can start selling and renting land to settlers. At the same time, you need to resolve this conflict so that you can get that process underway. And if you can't do that, then there will be squatters who will be settling on those lands that you hope to be able to legally rent and sell to settlers. So I think a lot of these people have a plan and a vision of how America will move west across the Ohio country. It requires government collaboration, or it requires collaboration between Congress and the land companies, but it also requiring the government to step in and provide a military solution if those treaty negotiations fail, which they did.
I was going to say, it seems that they did, because in September or October 1791, Arthur Sinclair launches the assault against the Miami Confederacy. Would you tell us about Sinclair's plans for the offensive and how he intended to remove the Native Americans who dared to defy the United States government?
Well, this was not a sudden, spontaneous effort. There'd actually been an American expedition into the same area of the country the year before, led by Josiah Harmer. And the idea was to strike at the center of the Confederacy, which was basically along the Maumee River in northwestern Ohio. Harmer's expedition was a failure. Some said it was a disaster. He burned empty villages and suffered fairly heavy casualties before he was able to extricate his army. So what that did was really just worsen the situation. And immediately the United States government, Henry Knox in particular, Secretary of War, is planning for a second campaign. So there's a lot of preparation going on, at least in the minds of Henry Knox, before this campaign gets underway. And the goal is that Arthur Sinclair will lead an American army from Fort Washington, what is now Cincinnati, head north to the Maumee River, where there is a cluster of Indian towns which form the core of this confederacy. And Sinclair's objective is to destroy those villages and on that spot to build an American fort, so that what you will get is an American occupation of this area. So he will build a couple of forts along the way, and then an American fort will replace, if you like, the enemy center of operations. And that will secure this territory for the United States and for settlement.
Do you think Henry Knox and George Washington really wanted the diplomatic side of these negotiations with the Native Americans to fail? Because as they're sending men out to negotiate with them, they're also preparing for war.
Yeah, I have to say that I think they do, because Henry Knox, ironically, I guess, in some ways, as Secretary of War, because Indian Affairs at this time is lodged in the Department of War. It's not until later that it's moved to the Department of the Interior. Henry Knox is a constant advocate, both in public and in his private correspondence, for dealing honorably with Indians, getting a treaty, and avoiding war. Not only on moral grounds, which he's quite articulate about, but also on very practical grounds. He says, we don't have a strong enough army. We can't afford it. This is going to war against Indians is a risky and expensive business. It's much better on all fronts if we can secure our objective through treaty. But they both come up against this problem that a treaty must involve Indians ceding their lands to the United States. And when Indians say no, then the United States really has no choice but to go in and take those lands in their way of thinking. Again, it looks like hypocrisy, and it may well be. It looks like deceitful conduct, and it may well be, because they have commissioners talking peace to the Indians, but they're also making military preparations. But those were the twin arms of the Indian policy as they envisioned it and articulated it and developed it for the United States, for the new nation. That first of all, you would try to deal with Indians honorably and fairly and make treaties with them. But if they refuse to cooperate, then you must and were justified in sending in the troops to destroy them. And I think that's a description of American Indian policy that is not unique to Henry Knox and George Washington's time. I think that kind of runs through well into the 19th century.
Did Knox's and Washington's recognition that the U.S. government really couldn't afford to wage a war against the Native Americans lead history to repeat itself? Was Sinclair's army and expedition hampered by the same problems of ill supply and ill-trained troops that had plagued George Washington during the War for Independence?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's a good point. And it's also the fact, of course, that there's a deep suspicion of standing armies, because the United States is a baby. It's just a couple of years after the Constitution's been adopted. The government is still in the process of, if you like, inventing itself, creating the infrastructure and the institutions, post offices, roads, mints, those kinds of things, and an army. And there's reluctance to create a national army. Like Englishmen, Americans were suspicious because government with an army could use that army for sinister purposes. So I think that those kind of attitudes lead towards a reliance on militia with a minimal army, which is what the United States have. To launch a campaign like this involves not only training the troops and equipping the troops, but it also in large measure involves raising the troops. You have to recruit the men to go on these campaigns, and that's something that was a problem. And Sinclair and other officers complained bitterly about the quality, if you like, of the recruits. People who were too old, too young, not accustomed to firing a gun even, and certainly not experienced in fighting Indians. And so the United States, when it was talking to Indians in treaty negotiations and when government was sending them messengers, would say, we want to deal fairly with you, we want to make a peace treaty with you, but if you don't listen to us, if you don't accept these good terms, we will crush you. And that was the image that both Washington and Knox and even Thomas Jefferson used. Actually, they weren't. They were still building that army. And so these were, as you say, problems that George Washington was all too familiar with from his experience during the Revolution.
So the Americans are ill-prepared. How about the Native Americans? How well prepared and trained were their warriors for the attack against the Americans?
Yeah, and of course they have the edge in all kinds of ways. One of the things that I always caution is the notion that the Indians are sort of natural-born warriors, and we often in our culture will use that term Indian warriors as if it's synonymous. And in some ways, Indian men are like American men at the time. They're militia. They're not professional soldiers. They're not at war all the time. For them, war is an unnatural state of affairs. It's something for which you prepare ritually and from which you return through important rituals of purification, etc. Having said that, of course, they are fighting for their homeland. They are fighting in their own environment. And they are, many of them, experienced fighters. The leaders of this coalition were men who had been fighting the Americans during the Revolution. Many of the warriors had that experience. I see it as a greater collective will. One of the things I wonder about as I'm reading the reports and the documents from this battle is, who stands to win from the American side? Is this a rich man's war and a poor man's fight? You don't have those questions from the Native American side. This is an invasion of their homeland, a direct threat to their villages, their families, their way of life, and their independence. So I think in all kinds of ways, not only are they better trained, more experienced, better equipped, but they are perhaps psychologically and also in spiritual ways better prepared for this conflict.
So the conflict that leads to the victory with no name takes place on November 4th, 1791. And it almost seems that the Native American offensive, it's the Native Americans who attacked the Americans, surprised the Americans. I believe there were descriptions of men coming out of their tents and didn't know what was going on because it just caught them off guard. So would you tell us about the battle? How many combatants did each side have, and what sorts of warfare did they employ?
What's interesting, one of the fascinating things reading the journals of the officers as the American army is advancing, and reading them, of course, with hindsight, knowing what's coming, is that they record sightings of Indians. Indians run off horses, there's a few skirmishes, Indians kill a soldier or two, but they keep insisting that the Indians don't know they're coming, and that their progress is kind of unseen. In fact, of course, the Indians are monitoring this. This is a huge lumbering army making tremendous racket with all of the appendages that an 18th century army had, hacking its way through the woods. Of course, the Indians knew it was coming. And when Sinclair makes camp that night, on the night of the 3rd, he thinks that he's within striking distance of the Indian villages, and that the next day, with a forced march, he'll get there. In fact, the Indian army is waiting 2 or 3 miles away. And during the night, they advance so that they are in position for an attack at dawn the next morning, and they attack in crescent formation. And they take the Americans completely by surprise. They hit militia who are encamped across a creek, send those guys scurrying back into the American lines, which are positioned on a kind of low hill, and chaos ensues. The Americans, as you say, they're taken by shock. People are coming out of tents, leaving their breakfast, officers shouting commands, etc. While this is going on, the Indians are very rapidly going down the sides, right? The horns of that crescent, if you like, they envelop the American encampment. And the Indians are picking off the officers and picking off the artillery crew. This is not a haphazard, wild, if you like, quote-unquote, savage attack. This is a carefully prepared and orchestrated assault. And it creates total confusion in the American lines. Remembering, of course, that many of these guys have never been in combat before. They've arrived here exhausted, ill-prepared, ill-supplied, and they're totally out of their element. And yet they kind of hold it together for 2 or 3 hours. There are bayonet charges to try and dislodge Indians. And of course, all that happens with the bayonet charges that, yes, they do dislodge the Indians. The Indians retreat in advance of the bayonet charge, and then the bayonet charge has kind of got nowhere to go, and it peters out and has to then retreat back to the lines with the Native Americans on its heels. And finally, Sinclair orders a retreat. The army heads back the way it had come. One of the officers said it was like a mob running at a fair. It turns very quickly into a rout, and it's a complete victory for the Native Americans and a complete disaster for the United States. Remembering, of course, what we said before, that this is actually the only army that the United States has at that time. And out of about 1,400 effectives on the morning of the battle, over 600 are killed, 200 or 300 more wounded, captives taken, non-combatants killed, artillery abandoned, supplies abandoned. This is a huge disaster for the United States and a huge victory for the Indian forces.
Wow, that really is a rout. Why do you think Sinclair and his officers so vastly underestimated the capabilities of the Native Americans? I mean, there's a long history of Native American prowess and ferocity on the battlefield. They only had to look back to like Braddock's campaign in 1755 to see that Native Americans were capable of routing Anglo-American forces.
That's a good question, and by that I mean it's one that I've thought about and not come up with a good answer for, because Braddock's defeat and the destruction of the British army at the Monongahela in 1754 was huge. It sent shockwaves through the colonies and through the British Empire. People knew about it. Some of the people who were the American command had, been there. Washington, of course, was there. And this almost was a replica of this. So the notion that this could not happen was not there. Of course, part of the response to Braddock's defeat had been that this was arrogant, inflexible, rigid British armies out of their element in the environment. But even just the year before, Harmer's army had been defeated. And as you read the correspondence and the documentation as Sinclair's army is advancing, what Sinclair is more concerned about is the same thing that George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry was concerned about as they were advancing to attack the Lakota and Cheyenne villages on the Little Bighorn in 1876. Not that they would be attacked by the Indians, but that the Indians would scatter before they got there. That's the worry. That's the fear, because Indians always did that. That was the saying, that Indians would not stand and fight. And what you're trying to do is catch them in a situation where they would stand and fight, because in those situations, so the thinking went, professional, organized, disciplined armies would always win. But as you say, there's plenty of examples where that didn't happen. And so on one level, I think you have to put it down to there's an element of racism here, right? They're Indians. While they may be in their element burning cabins and lifting scalps in the woods, when it comes down to a real battle, that Western military will prevail.
The title of your book, The Victory with No Name, kind of foreshadows how the United States would respond to this. Well, it was such a rout, we don't want to remember it. But really, how do the Native Americans and the United States government respond to this battle? I mean, do the combatants ever seek to obtain peace with one another?
Yes, in fact, the aftermath of the battle sees a flurry of peace initiatives, particularly from the United States, who have to do a number of things. One thing they have to do is make sure that the Iroquois of New York don't join this Indian coalition wholeheartedly. Some Ohio Iroquois were there, some Canadian Iroquois were there, but by and large, the Iroquois League had not been involved, and the fear was that if that happened, this would be an impossible situation for the United States. So there are American delegates, emissaries go to Iroquois country. Iroquois chiefs visit Washington and Philadelphia. At the same time, the United States sends peace initiatives to the Western tribes, to the people who've defeated them, to talk peace. And again, you can look at this as either a legitimate attempt to fashion a peaceful solution, or as really an attempt to buy time while the United States rebuilt its army. And I think it's Thomas Jefferson who basically says that that's what it is, right? When the peace initiatives fairly says, well, okay, we've done what we needed to do to convince our citizens that we were in earnest trying to make peace. The Indians have turned us down, and now we can unleash this new army on them. From the Indian perspective, they are the victors. They've now turned back two American armies, and they've totally destroyed the second of them. So it's really not incumbent upon them to go cap in hand to the United States and ask for peace. But of course, this is a coalition, and like all coalitions, it's vulnerable to fracture. And like all colonial powers, the United States is well aware of the potential for divide and rule or divide and conquer strategies. And so when the United States makes offers of peace, you don't get a monolithic Native American response, because different groups within the Confederacy have different ideas. The Shawnees and the Miamis, who have been kind of the hardliners in the Confederacy, basically say, we've been fighting for the Ohio River as the boundary. That's the only peace we will accept. Other groups say, well, maybe we could accept a compromise. Maybe we could give up the Ohio River and draw a boundary line at the Muskingum River. So these divisions creep in among victorious Indian groups. Some Indians who've come from farther afield and are not immediately threatened probably will have returned home after the battle. This was a huge victory, and so they would then go back to their homes and villages, and they need to be kind of resummoned when another American army comes. This is a battle that causes huge concern. Embedded in the newspapers, there were congressional investigations, all these kinds of things. And it's really a couple of years before the United States rebuilt its army. And one of the things it's learned from Sinclair's defeat is that if it's going to defeat Indians, it needs a more professional, better trained, better prepared army that is trained to fight in Indian country. And Washington appoints a new general, General Anthony Wayne, to build that army. The army is reorganized. The financing of the army is upped. It it really, I think, changes the way in which the United States understands it needs to wage its wars against Indians. And so when those peace initiatives, those peace talks, whether they were legitimate and fully intentioned or not, when they fail, then a second army, Anthony Wayne's army, advances into Indian country. And by that time, the Indian coalition is already weakened, right, because of these divisions. And 3 years later, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, Anthony Wayne is able to secure the victory over the Indian coalition that Sinclair had failed to achieve in 1791.
Now that you've provided us with a conclusion to that story, let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
So, Colin, are you prepared? Because I may muck your story up just a little bit with this hypothetical history question.
Okay.
In your opinion, what might have happened if the British had not forsaken their Native American allies in the Treaty of Paris, 1783? Would relations have been different between the United States and Native Americans? Would a provision for Native Americans in that treaty have altered the history of the settlement of the Old Northwest Territory?
Yeah, it's kind of, these are questions that historians often shudder at or evade. But it's a question I've thought about a lot. And of course, being British, I'd like to think that the answer was yes. If Indian country had remained part of the British Empire, things would have been different. Or if the British had made adequate provision for their Indian allies at the Treaty of Paris, things have been different. And the British like to think so too, because actually later, maybe 10 to a dozen years late, when it was too late, they actually talked to the United States and talked with Indian leaders about creating an independent Indian state in what is now the heartland of America that would have been supported by the British but would have been independent from the United States. In reality, I think maybe it wouldn't have been that much different, because even though I think Indian people in 1783, 1790 might think it might have been different, in fact, what the American government, the United States government, tries to do in some ways resembles what the British had tried to do. Whether you're a government in London or a government in Philadelphia or Washington, the problem is, how do you control a frontier? So Washington, who'd been very resentful and resistant of British attempts to control and restrain his land speculations and to stop the flood of immigration onto Indian land, once in government, does much the same kind of thing with much the same results. It's almost impossible to enforce that. So I think whereas British government was more inclined to try and control the frontier, and the new American government recognized it had no choice but to open Indian lands for settlement, I think the demographic realities were that the press of population on Indian lands would likely have created similar problems, similar tensions, and similar conflicts, even under British regime, or even with British support. And of course, British support for Indians was always complicated by the fact that the British were not only watching what was going on in North America, they were always, through this period, watching what was going on in revolutionary France and with Europe as well. Those concerns trumped the North American concerns. So, yeah, it's something where you can follow these alternative paths and speculate as to how things might have been different, and they would have been different. But I think the larger picture and the larger historical realities eventually lead me to think that they wouldn't have been that much different.
Well, thank you for giving us those thought-provoking options. Before we conclude, would you tell us what aspect of history you're researching and writing about now?
Well, actually, it's a related aspect. I'm writing a book on which I'm calling The Indian World of George Washington. And partly the victory with no name was kind of a stepping stone to get me into this, because, of course, Washington is perhaps the most written about, most famous figure in American history. He's an icon of American history. There are lots of biographies of Washington, but very few pay much attention to Native Americans and the role of Native America in shaping the life of Washington, and thereby in shaping the life of the nation that he helped create. And the Washington's correspondence is full of information, materials, documents on Native Americans, because of course Washington was, from almost cradle to grave, obsessed with Western lands, and those Western lands were Indian land. He met just about every prominent Native American leader in his time. He was a key figure in the French and Indian War. During the Revolution, he sent armies into Indian country. As I document in this book, he lost an army in Indian country. He's a key player in forging a national Indian policy. And so this is a way of writing another book about George Washington, but it's actually a book about 18th century Indian America and the importance of Indian America to understanding the United States in those formative years.
That will certainly be an interesting view, not only of Washington, but of Indian country. So best of luck to you on that. Where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
You can get some information on me by simply accessing the websites of the History Department or the Native American Studies program at Dartmouth College. I'm a joint appointment. I teach my courses are cross-listed. They count for both. So that's one way. And the best way to contact me is probably by email, which is quite simple. It's simply colin.callaway@dartmouth.edu.
And we'll include links to those places in the show notes page for this episode. Well, Colin, thank you so much for bringing back this battle into our collective memory. It offers not only a great window into viewing how the West was settled, but really into how the young federal government worked and what it was thinking. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. It's my pleasure.
Long before 1791, Native American warriors had proven their prowess on the battlefield. And yet, hubris caused both Europeans and Americans to repeatedly underestimate their military abilities. This overconfidence cost both groups time and again. It cost Britons their lives in 1755 during Braddock's campaign, and about 1,000 American lives during the victory with no name, the Battle along the Wabash in 1791. Colin also made some very interesting points about how the early United States conducted its diplomacy with Native American groups. George Washington and Henry Knox wished to deal fairly with Native American peoples, and yet they also negotiated knowing that if the Native Americans refused to cede their land to the United States, the government and its military would take their land by force. You can find more information about Colin, his book, The Victory with No Name, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode. You'll find it all at benfranklinsworld.com/029. Have you told your friends, family, and fellow history lovers about Ben Franklin's World yet? Please help us bring Ben Franklin's World to the attention of our fellow history lovers by telling them about this podcast. Word of mouth is still the best way for us to make Ben Franklin's World visible and findable to our fellow history lovers. Finally, why do you think the battle along the Wabash has remained nameless and has been lost from our collective historical memory? Email me your answers, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, or tweet me @LizCovart.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.